They thought silence meant weakness, but sometimes silence is the loudest warning you'll ever miss. The patrol lights washed the park in red and blue as Ava Carter stood with her back against the rough trunk, her wrists secured, her posture still, her breathing steady, as if the cold night air didn't bother her at all, as if the weight of what was happening hadn't even touched her yet. And that was the first thing that felt wrong, because people in her position were supposed to panic, supposed to plead, supposed to break under pressure. But Ava didn't do any of that. She simply looked ahead, eyes calm, focused, almost distant, like she was watching something unfold that only she could see, while Officer Daniel Brooks leaned casually nearby, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips, glancing at his partner Ryan Keller as if this was just another routine stop, just another moment where authority went unquestioned. "You picked the wrong place to wander tonight," Brooks muttered, his tone low but sharp, expecting a reaction, expecting fear, but Ava didn't give him that, not even a flinch, just a quiet inhale, slow and controlled, the kind of breath that didn't belong to someone afraid. And that silence started to stretch, filling the space between them, pressing against the tension in the air until even Keller shifted slightly, glancing at her with something he couldn't quite name, because it wasn't defiance, it wasn't arrogance, it was something else, something steadier, something that didn't match the situation at all. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint hum of distant traffic, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, like the night itself was waiting, watching, holding its breath. And Ava finally spoke, her voice even, almost quiet, but clear enough to cut through everything around them. "You really should have checked first." And the words didn't sound like a threat. They sounded like a statement, simple, direct, certain, and Brooks let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if dismissing it, because from where he stood, there was nothing to check, nothing to question, just another situation already under control, already decided, and yet something about the way she said it lingered, like an echo that didn't fade, like a door that had just been opened somewhere unseen. And then it happened, not loud, not dramatic, just a sharp crackle from the radio at Brooks' shoulder, a sudden shift in tone, in energy, in everything. "All units stand down immediately." The voice came through urgent, unmistakable, and both officers froze for half a second too long, exchanging a look that said more than words ever could, because whatever they thought this was, whatever they thought she was, something had just changed, and neither of them was ready for what that meant. The words hung in the air long after the radio went silent, and for the first time that night, Officer Daniel Brooks did not look amused, his fingers tightening slightly around the device clipped to his shoulder as if he could force it to explain itself, while Ryan Keller took a small step back, eyes shifting from the radio to Ava and then back again, trying to make sense of something that did not fit the script they had already written in their minds, because situations like this were supposed to be simple, predictable, controlled, but nothing about this moment felt controlled anymore. Not the sudden urgency in the voice that had just cut through their authority, not the stillness of the woman in front of them, and certainly not the quiet confidence that seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against the leaves above, and Ava closed her eyes for just a brief moment, as if listening to something beyond the sound of the trees, beyond the presence of the two men standing in front of her. And when she opened them again, there was no trace of uncertainty, only clarity, only patience, the kind that does not come from hope but from certainty. "Dispatch must have made a mistake," Brooks muttered, though his voice lacked the sharp edge it carried before, and even he seemed to hear it, the small crack forming in his own confidence. Because mistakes like that did not happen without a reason, not with that tone, not with that urgency. Keller swallowed, glancing down the empty path that stretched beyond the park, his instincts telling him something was off, something bigger than a routine call. "Should we check in again?" he asked, his voice lower now, careful, but Brooks shook his head quickly, as if rejecting the idea before it could take root. "No, we finish what we started," he said, though this time it sounded more like reassurance to himself than an order to his partner, and Ava watched them both, her gaze steady, almost compassionate, as if she had already seen how this would end and was simply waiting for them to catch up. The silence returned, heavier now, no longer empty but filled with questions neither officer wanted to ask. And then, From somewhere beyond the darkness of the park entrance, a new sound emerged, low at first, then growing clearer, the unmistakable hum of an engine approaching with purpose, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, controlled, and both men turned toward it instinctively, their bodies reacting before their minds could fully process what was happening. Headlights appeared between the trees, cutting through the shadows, bright and unwavering. And as the vehicle rolled closer, its presence seemed to shift the air itself, like a line being drawn that could not be crossed back over. Brooks straightened, trying to regain the posture of authority he had carried so easily just minutes ago. But there was something different now, something uncertain beneath the surface, something he could not quite push away. The vehicle came to a smooth stop just a few yards away, engine still running, lights illuminating the scene in a stark, unfiltered glow. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the night itself was holding its breath again, waiting for what would come next. And Ava finally tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, almost gentle, but carrying a weight that neither man could ignore. "You still have time to think about what you do next," she said. And this time, there was no mistaking it. This was not a warning born from fear. It was an invitation, one last chance offered before something irreversible began to unfold. The doors of the vehicle opened with quiet precision, not rushed, not dramatic, just controlled. And that control said more than any shouted command ever could, because it was the kind of control that did not need to prove itself. A man stepped out first, tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit that caught the reflection of the patrol lights without losing its sharp edge, his eyes scanning the scene in one smooth motion, not stopping on the officers, not lingering on the surroundings, but landing directly on Ava as if she had always been the center of this moment. And for the first time since the night began, the balance shifted without a single word being spoken. Ryan Keller felt it immediately, that subtle but undeniable change in the air, like stepping into a room where the rules were different, where the authority he thought he had no longer applied. And he swallowed, his throat suddenly dry, while Brooks stood firm, or at least tried to, his posture stiffening as he stepped forward slightly, attempting to reclaim the ground beneath him. "This area is restricted," he said, his voice louder than necessary, sharper than before, but it did not land the way he expected, because the man did not react to the tone, did not acknowledge the authority behind it. Instead, he walked forward at a steady pace, each step deliberate, measured, as if he had already decided exactly how this would unfold. Two more individuals stepped out from the vehicle behind him, both dressed similarly, both silent, their presence reinforcing something that Brooks could not quite define but could definitely feel. And then the man spoke, his voice calm, even, but carrying a weight that cut through everything else. "Officers, I suggest you take a moment and reassess this situation." And it was not a suggestion in the way Brooks understood suggestions. It was not optional. It was not open for debate. It was a line being drawn, clear and immovable. Keller glanced at Brooks, waiting for a response, waiting for direction. But Brooks hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and that hesitation was enough to reveal everything. Because men who were certain did not hesitate. Men who were in control did not pause. And Ava watched it all unfold without moving, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, as if this was exactly where things were supposed to go. The man's gaze shifted briefly toward her restraints, then back to the officers, and something in his eyes hardened, not with anger, not with aggression, but with recognition, like a piece of a puzzle falling into place. "You received a direct order to stand down," he continued, his tone still level, still controlled. "I am giving you the opportunity to comply." And the words settled heavily, not because of how they were said, but because of what they implied. Brooks felt it now, the weight pressing against his earlier confidence, the creeping realization that this was no longer a situation he could define, no longer something he could control with tone or presence. And yet his pride held on, stubborn, unwilling to let go. "We are handling an investigation," he replied, though the conviction in his voice had thinned. "We have reason to detain her." And for a moment, silence followed, not empty, not passive, but charged, as if the night itself was waiting to see which version of the truth would hold. The man took one final step forward, stopping just short of the line Brooks had drawn, his eyes steady, unblinking, and when he spoke again, there was no edge, no raised voice, just clarity. Then you should have verified who you were dealing with. And that was when Keller felt it fully, the shift turning into something undeniable, something irreversible, because whatever came next was not going to be controlled by them anymore. The air tightened around those last words, not because they were loud, but because they were undeniable, and Officer Daniel Brooks felt it settle into his chest like a weight he could not shift, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read the man in front of him, searching for any sign of uncertainty, any crack that would give him something to push against. But there was nothing, no hesitation, no second-guessing, just calm authority standing where his own used to be, and for the first time that night, Brooks did not feel like the one in control. Ryan Keller noticed it too, the way Brooks' shoulders no longer carried that same ease, the way his stance had changed ever so slightly, like someone adjusting to ground that was no longer steady beneath their feet. And Keller's gaze drifted back to Ava, still standing there, still silent, still composed in a way that made everything else feel louder, messier, out of place. As if her stillness was exposing the chaos they had created, the man in the suit took a slow breath, his eyes moving briefly toward Ava again, then back to the officers, and when he spoke, his tone did not rise, did not sharpen, it simply became clearer, more defined. "This is your final opportunity to correct your actions," he said, and the words did not feel like a warning anymore. They felt like a line closing, like a door that would not stay open much longer. Brooks exhaled through his nose, a small, controlled motion, but inside, something was shifting, something he had not prepared for, because this was not how situations like this were supposed to unfold, not for him, not in a place where he believed he understood every rule, every boundary, every outcome. "We followed procedure," he replied, though even as he said it, the words felt thinner than they should have, like they were missing something essential, like they were no longer enough to hold the moment together. Keller glanced at him quickly, surprised by how uncertain that sounded, and then the man stepped slightly to the side, just enough to reveal the second figure standing behind him, a woman holding a tablet, her expression focused, her posture precise. And she tapped the screen once before looking up. "Body camera footage has been synced and reviewed," she said calmly, her voice carrying the same steady confidence. "Timeline confirms deviation from protocol," and the words landed without force, without accusation, but they echoed louder than anything else had so far, because they were not opinions, not interpretations, they were facts, and facts did not bend. Brooks felt his jaw tighten, his mind racing through every step, every decision, every moment that had led to this, trying to find something he could still stand on, something that had not just been taken away, but the silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. Ava shifted, slightly for the first time, not in discomfort, not in resistance, just a small movement that drew attention back to her presence. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was no softness in what it carried. "Authority does not come from control," she said, her eyes meeting Brooks directly. "It comes from accountability." And something in that sentence settled deeper than anything else had, because it did not challenge him, it revealed him, and for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as the truth of the situation stood there, clear and unchanging, waiting for the next choice to be made. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty. It felt final, like something invisible had just been decided and no one in that space could undo it. And Officer Daniel Brooks stood there trying to hold on to what was left of his authority, but it was slipping in ways he could not control, not because anyone had taken it from him directly, but because the foundation beneath it was no longer there. Ryan Keller shifted his weight again, his eyes moving between the suited man, the woman, with the tablet, and Ava. And for the first time since they had arrived, he felt something he had not expected to feel tonight. Not confidence, not certainty, but doubt, quiet and persistent, pressing in from all sides. The man in the suit took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to make it clear that this was no longer a negotiation. "Remove the restraints," he said calmly. And there was no urgency in his voice, no aggression, just a level of authority that did not need to be raised to be understood. Keller glanced at Brooks immediately, waiting, searching for direction, but Brooks did not respond right away. His jaw set, his mind moving through the situation as if there was still a way to regain control, still a way to justify everything that had happened. But the longer he stood there, the more obvious it became that there was no path back to the version of the night he had started with. The version where everything made sense and nothing could be questioned. Ava remained still, her eyes steady, not demanding, not pleading, simply present, and that presence carried more weight than any command could have, because it forced them to confront what they had done without a single accusation. Keller finally reached for the key, his hand slower than usual, more deliberate, as if the act itself meant more now than it had just minutes ago. And when the restraints were removed, Ava did not move right away. She did not rush forward or step away. She simply lowered her hands and let them rest at her sides, as if reclaiming something that had never truly been taken from her in the first place. The man in the suit nodded once, a small, controlled acknowledgement, before turning slightly toward Brooks. His expression unchanged, but his eyes sharper now, more focused. "This situation is now under federal review," he said, and the words carried a weight that extended far beyond the moment, far beyond the park, into something larger, something that Brooks could not ignore. "Your actions will be documented and evaluated accordingly." And there was no threat in the statement, no attempt to intimidate, just the certainty of process, of consequence, of accountability that did not depend on emotion. Brooks exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders finally showing in the way they dropped just slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because somewhere in that moment, he understood that this was no longer about control, no longer about being right. It was about facing something he had not expected to face. Keller stepped back, giving space without being told, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet awareness that things had shifted in a way he could not reverse. Ava finally took a step forward, her movement calm, unhurried, and as she passed Brooks, she paused for just a second, not long enough to draw attention from anyone else, but long enough for him to hear her voice, soft, steady, undeniable. "The truth does not rush," she said. "It waits until you cannot ignore it." And then she continued walking, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than anything that had come before, because this time, it was not filled with uncertainty, it was filled with understanding. The night did not return to what it had been, even after Ava walked past them, even after the restraints were gone, because something had shifted too deeply to be undone, and Officer Daniel Brooks stood there watching her move away with a calm that did not belong to someone who had just been restrained, a calm that felt earned, not given. And that was what stayed with him, not the arrival of the vehicle, not the words from the man in the suit, but that quiet certainty she carried as if she had never been out of control for a single second. Ryan Keller remained a few steps behind, his hands resting at his sides, unsure of where to place them, unsure of what came next, because there had always been a next step before, a clear procedure, a defined path. But now the structure felt different, heavier, like every move would be seen, recorded, remembered. The woman with the tablet moved closer to the suited man, speaking in a low voice that still carried across the space. "Full report will be transmitted within the hour," she said, her tone precise, efficient, as if this was simply part of a larger system already in motion, already advancing without pause. The suited man gave a slight nod, his attention briefly shifting back toward Brooks, and in that glance there was no anger, no accusation, just recognition, the kind that came from having seen this before, from knowing exactly how moments like this unfolded. "You will be contacted for formal statements," he said evenly, and again there was no need to raise his voice, because the outcome was no longer uncertain. Brooks inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of those words settle in, not as a threat, but as a certainty he could not argue against, because this was no longer about what he believed had happened. It was about what had been recorded, what had been verified, what would be reviewed by people far removed from this park, people who would not be influenced by tone or presence or assumption. Keller looked toward Ava again, now standing near the vehicle, speaking quietly with one of the individuals who had arrived, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged, and it struck him then that she had never once asked for help, never once demanded anything. And yet everything had shifted around her anyway, as if the truth did not need to be forced, only revealed at the right moment. Brooks finally lowered his gaze for a brief second, not in defeat, but in reflection, the kind that comes when there is no longer anything to push against, when the only thing left is to face what is in front of you. And for the first time that night, he did not try to explain, did not try to justify. He simply stood there, letting the silence settle into something real, something unavoidable. The suited man turned slightly, preparing to leave, his role in this moment complete. But before he stepped away, he paused just long enough to add one final sentence, his voice steady, measured, carrying the weight of experience rather than emotion. "Power is not proven in moments of control," he said. "It is revealed in moments like this." And then he walked toward the vehicle, the others following without hesitation, without question, because they did not need direction. They already understood their place in the sequence of events. Ava stepped closer to the open door, then stopped, turning her head just enough to glance back at the two officers, not with judgment, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, understanding, as if she could see exactly where this would lead for them. And when she spoke, her voice carried across the quiet park with a clarity that lingered long after the words were gone. "What you do when no one is watching," she said, "is what defines you when everyone finally is." And with that, she stepped into the vehicle, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the two men standing in a silence that no longer felt empty, but filled with something they could not escape, something that would follow them long after the lights had faded. The vehicle disappeared down the road without urgency, its taillights fading into the distance as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But the silence it left behind was heavier than before, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting, but settled, final, and Officer Daniel Brooks remained standing exactly where he was, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the vehicle had been. Just seconds ago, as if trying to understand how everything had shifted so completely in such a short time. Ryan Keller exhaled slowly beside him, the tension in his chest finally releasing in a way that did not feel like relief, but something closer to realization, because what had happened was not just a mistake, not just a moment. It was something that would not simply fade with time, something that would follow them beyond this park, beyond this night. Brooks finally moved, just a slight shift of his stance, but even that felt different now, less certain, less grounded, and he reached up to adjust the radio on his shoulder out of habit. Though there was nothing left to hear, no new instruction, no correction, just the quiet hum of a system that had already moved on to the next step. Keller glanced at him, searching for something familiar, some sign that things would return to normal. But there was no clear direction this time, no confident command to follow, only a shared understanding that whatever came next would not be like before. The wind moved through the trees again, softer now, carrying the faint sounds of the city in the distance, a reminder that the world outside this moment continued without pause, without hesitation, and yet for them, time felt slower, heavier, like every second carried more weight than it had earlier that evening. Brooks finally spoke, his voice lower than usual, not because he was trying to be quiet, but because something inside him had shifted. "We did what we thought was right," he said, though the words did not land with the certainty they once would have, and Keller did not respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on the ground where Ava had stood, replaying the moment in his mind, not the beginning, not the decision to stop her, but the way she had remained calm, the way she had not reacted the way he expected, and how that should have meant something, how that should have made him pause, question, reconsider. "Thinking is not the same as knowing," Keller finally said, his voice steady but quiet, and Brooks turned slightly, surprised by the response, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied. Because Keller had never spoken like that before, not in situations like this, not in a way that challenged the assumptions they both carried, and for a moment, neither of them said anything else, the weight of that sentence settling between them, filling the space with something new, something neither of them had fully faced until now. The park felt different without the flashing lights, without the presence of the others, quieter, more exposed, as if the absence of distraction made everything clearer, and Brooks took a slow breath, his gaze lifting from the ground to the trees around them, the same trees that had stood there before, unchanged, unaffected by what had just taken place, And that contrast made everything feel sharper, more real, because while the world stayed the same, something inside him had shifted in a way he could not ignore, something that would not simply reset when the shift ended. Keller stepped back slightly, giving space again, but this time it was not uncertainty, it was intention, as if he understood that whatever came next was something Brooks would have to face on his own. And as they stood there in the quiet, the absence of noise felt louder than anything that had happened before, because now there was nothing left to cover the truth, nothing left to distract from it. Only the realization that what had seemed like control was never truly theirs to begin with. And that realization did not fade. It stayed, settling deeper with every passing second. The drive back felt longer than it should have. Even though the distance had not changed, even though the streets were the same, the streetlights casting their steady glow across empty intersections and quiet storefronts. But inside the patrol car, nothing felt familiar, nothing felt routine, and Officer Daniel Brooks kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, yet his mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying moments not in order but in fragments. The silence, her voice, the way everything shifted without force, and beside him, Ryan Keller sat without speaking, not because there was nothing to say, but because anything said too soon would sound hollow, incomplete, and the radio remained quiet, not a single call breaking through. As if even the system understood that this moment needed space, needed time to settle into something real. Brooks finally exhaled, a slow release he had been holding since they left the park, and his voice came out lower than usual, more measured. "It is going to be reviewed," he said, not as a question, not as a concern, but as a statement he could not avoid. And Keller nodded slightly, his gaze fixed ahead. "Everything is," he replied. And there was no judgment in his tone, no accusation, just acknowledgement, because that was the part neither of them could change, not now, not later, not ever. What had happened was already part of something larger, something that would not disappear with time or distance. The car passed under another set of lights, shadows shifting briefly across their faces, and Brooks tightened his grip on the steering wheel just slightly. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to feel, because control had always been something he relied on, something he believed in, and now it felt different, not gone, but redefined in a way he had not prepared for. "We followed what we thought was right," he repeated, quieter this time, as if saying it again might make it feel more solid. But Keller did not respond immediately, his silence carrying more weight than agreement ever could. And after a moment, he spoke, his voice calm, steady, but unmistakably different from before. "Sometimes what feels right is just what feels familiar." And the words settled into the space between them, not as a challenge, but as something deeper, something that did not need to be argued, because it was not about winning a point, it was about recognizing a truth, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but stays persistent until it can no longer be ignored. Brooks did not answer right away, his eyes still forward, but something in his expression shifted, subtle, almost unnoticeable, yet real, as if a part of him had started to question not just the moment at the park, but the pattern behind it, the assumptions that had shaped his decisions long before tonight. And outside, the city moved on without hesitation. Cars passing, lights changing, people continuing their routines unaware of the shift that had taken place in a quiet park just miles away. But inside the vehicle, time still felt slower, heavier, like every second carried the weight of what came next. The report, the review, the conversations that would follow, and more than that, the realization that this was not just about a single incident, not just about one decision. It was about something larger, something that would require more than explanation, more than justification, something that would require change. And that was the part that lingered, not as pressure, not as fear, but as a quiet understanding that once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen, no matter how much you wish it could be. And as the patrol car continued down the road, the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt necessary, like the space where something new begins to form, slowly, deliberately, without noise, but with meaning that would last far beyond this night.